The air smelled of fresh roses, their petals dusted across the aisle like remnants of a dream. Golden drapes swayed gently with the breeze filtering through the grand cathedral doors. Guests murmured in hushed excitement, eyes sparkling with anticipation. The music played softly, violins singing in perfect harmony. At the altar, Daniel stood tall, adjusting his cufflinks, breathing deeply. His gaze drifted to the massive double doors, then back to the priest. There was a tension in his stance, something unreadable in his expression. Sophie stood in the bridal suite, staring at her reflection in the antique mirror. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but excitement. Her life was about to begin, a new chapter, a future she had dreamt of since the moment Daniel proposed. She lifted her veil, exhaling slowly. Today was perfect. Nothing could go wrong. A gentle knock. A bridesmaid peeked in, eyes gleaming. "It's time," she whispered. Sophie smiled, gathering the delicate fabric of her dress as she turned toward the door. The world outside the suite was a blur of soft candlelight and familiar faces. Her father stood at the end of the hall, his smile warm and reassuring. Together they stepped forward. Step by step, she walked down the aisle, the weight of the moment settling into her chest. Gasps of admiration filled the room, but Sophie barely noticed. Her gaze was locked on one person, Daniel. And then, everything shifted. The moment her eyes reached the altar, her breath caught in her throat. The spot where Daniel stood was empty. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Confusion settled like a fog over the room. Sophie's steps faltered. The bouquet trembled in her hands. Her father whispered, "Where is he?" A nervous laugh escaped someone in the crowd. The priest exchanged a look with the wedding planner. Still, no one moved. Sophie turned to her bridesmaids. They all shook their heads, equally bewildered. Daniel had been there. Just moments ago, he was there. A heavy silence swallowed the room. The priest cleared his throat, his voice tight with uncertainty. "Perhaps a moment's delay?" More whispers. Her mother gripped her hands, voice hushed but urgent. "Maybe he's in the back? Nervous?" Nervous? Daniel wasn't the kind to be nervous. He was calm, steady, always. Sophie turned, lifting the layers of her dress as she hurried down the aisle, past the puzzled guests, past the murmuring voices, past the priest. She reached the back of the venue. No Daniel. She burst into the dressing rooms, empty. Her hands shook as she clutched the fabric of her gown. "Daniel?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, cracking with uncertainty. No answer. A sinking feeling spread through her stomach. She rushed toward the hallway, passing servers, musicians, staff, none of whom had seen him leave. She searched, room after room. Nothing. Panic swelled in her chest, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She turned a corner. Her wedding planner stood there, eyes wide. "Where is he?" Sophie demanded, voice edged with desperation. The planner shook her head slowly. I don't know." It didn't make sense. He was there. He was at the altar. He wouldn't just leave. She ran to the parking lot. His car sat there, untouched. She pulled out her phone, dialing his number. The ring echoed through the vast emptiness. No answer. She called again. Still nothing. Her bouquet slipped from her fingers, landing softly on the pavement. Daniel was gone. Just gone. No one saw him leave. No one knew where he went. A groom, moments away from saying "I do," had simply vanished. Her heart pounded in her ears. Her hands trembled. A cold dread wrapped around her like a shadow, tightening its grip. This wasn't cold feet. This wasn't nerves. This was something else. Something was wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. And Sophie had no idea that this was just the beginning. The nightmare had only begun. What would you do if your future, your love, your whole life disappeared in the blink of an eye? Would you search? Would you wait? Or would you try to move on? Tell me in the comments. Because this story, it's far from over. 20 years. 2 decades had come and gone, and yet, time had done little to erase the scars. The world had moved on. Seasons had changed. Years had melted into one another. And the people who had once gasped in shock on her wedding day had long since stopped asking about Daniel. But for Sophie, the questions never faded. She sat alone in the dim glow of a flickering lamp, fingers tracing the edges of a worn-out wedding album. The binding was frayed, the pages curling at the edges from years of being opened and closed again and again, as if somewhere between those pages she might find the answers that had eluded her. She turned to the first photograph, the one where she and Daniel stood beneath a tree, their arms wrapped around each other, smiles stretched across their faces. It was taken the summer before the wedding, back when love felt simple, back when she still believed in forever. Her fingers trembled as she flipped to the next page. A wedding invitation, now yellowed with time, pressed between the pages like a relic of a life that had never been lived. His name, Daniel Pierce, printed in elegant gold script. It was supposed to be a promise. Instead, it was a reminder of the day everything fell apart. The newspaper clipping lay beside her on the table, the headline glaring back at her like a cruel joke. Groom goes missing on wedding day, no leads found. No leads, no answers, no closure. Sophie leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint tapping of rain against the window. The kind of night that made memories creep back in, whispering things she tried to forget. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays spent alone, while everyone else built families, while the world continued without him. She had stayed frozen in time, trapped in an endless loop of what-ifs. Was he taken? Did he leave on his own? Was he alive? The worst part wasn't the not knowing. It was the fact that no matter how much she tried to let go, she couldn't. She had tried to move on, tried to love again. But every time she looked into another man's eyes, all she saw was Daniel. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window. She shivered, pulling her sweater tighter around her shoulders. And then, something caught her eye. A drawer she hadn't opened in years. She hesitated. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because she already knew what was inside. She reached for the handle, pulling it open slowly. Dust coated the forgotten trinkets within. Old letters, a watch that had long since stopped ticking, a photograph of her parents on their wedding day. And then, at the very bottom, something she didn't remember putting there. A small iron key. It was old, heavier than it should have been. The metal was cold against her palm, rough with age. Her heartbeat quickened. Where had this come from? She turned it over in her hand, her mind racing. She had never seen it before, had she? A memory stirred in the back of her mind, a flash of something familiar, and then she remembered the wedding venue. There had been a locked door in the basement, a door she had never seen opened, a door no one ever spoke about, a door that, for some reason, felt important now. She swallowed hard, her breath unsteady. Could it be? It was ridiculous. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to find this key. That after 20 years, something, or someone, was leading her back. Her grip tightened around the key. There was only one way to find out. Would you go back? Would you unlock a door that had been closed for 2 decades? Would you chase the truth, no matter what it cost you? Tell me in the comments. If you were Sophie, would you keep searching? Or would you let the past stay buried? The key sat heavy in her palm, its cold metal sending an eerie chill through her fingertips. It didn't belong in her house. She had never seen it before. And yet, it had been buried in her drawer, waiting for what? Sophie exhaled slowly, gripping the key tighter as she stood up. Her legs felt unsteady, as if her body already knew she was about to step into something far bigger than she could understand. She wasn't the kind of person who believed in signs, but this felt like something. She moved through the apartment, her fingers grazing against the walls as if grounding herself in the present. The wind outside howled, rattling against the window pane. The storm had grown stronger, the rain heavier. And yet, she barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, on the past, on the door, on the truth. She stopped in the hallway, eyes flickering toward the entrance of the basement. The door was just as it had always been, plain, unassuming. But now, standing before it, she noticed something she never had before: a draft. The faintest whisper of air curling around the edges of the doorframe. Her breath hitched. That wasn't possible. The basement had no windows, no ventilation, but she felt it. Something behind that door was breathing. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to move. Her fingers reached for the handle, cold, icy cold. She shuddered, but she didn't pull away. The key. Her hand trembled as she lifted it toward the lock. Would it fit? Would she even want it to? She hesitated, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. And then, click. The key slid in perfectly. A sick sense of dread clawed at her chest. She shouldn't do this. She should turn around, but she didn't. With a deep breath, she turned the key. The lock groaned in protest, as if it had not been disturbed in decades. Dust trickled down the frame as the mechanism gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a set of stairs descending into absolute darkness. The air that rushed out smelled of damp wood and something else. Something old, something forgotten. Her fingers fumbled along the wall, searching for a light switch. Nothing. The basement had always been storage space, boxes of old belongings, things she hadn't touched in years. But as she took the first step down, an unease settled deep in her bones. The floorboards beneath her groaned. The air felt heavier. She gripped the railing, steadying herself as she moved deeper. One step, then another. The dim glow from the open door barely reached the bottom. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. And then, a sound, a soft creak, like something shifting. She froze. The darkness was thick, pressing against her like unseen hands. And then she saw it. At the farthest end of the room, just beyond where the light could reach, a chest. Large, wooden. A deep mahogany color, covered in dust, its edges worn from time. Her pulse quickened. She didn't remember ever putting a chest in her basement. Had it always been there? She stepped forward, the floor beneath her feet sighing under the pressure. The chest loomed closer, its presence almost waiting. Her hands shook as she reached out. She hesitated. What was inside? She wasn't sure she wanted to know, but something told her she had to open it. That whatever was inside was meant for her to find. Her fingers brushed against the wood. It was smooth, cold. The air shifted. Another creak. She wasn't alone. Something was here. Something watching. Her breath came fast now, shallow. She swallowed her fear, gripping the lid. And then she pulled. The hinges screamed in protest. The air inside rushed out, thick with the scent of something long hidden. Her heart stopped. Inside the chest, she gasped. And then, darkness. Something wasn't right, a draft. A locked door she had never noticed before. And that key, it felt like it was meant for this moment. With a deep breath, she turned the lock. The door swung open with a sound so chilling, it sent a shiver down her spine. And then, she saw it. A wooden chest. What could be inside? Would you open it if you were her? Let me know in the comments. The air inside the chest was thick, dust curling into the dim light, carrying the scent of something long forgotten. Sophie's fingers trembled as she reached inside. her breath coming in shallow gasps. The first thing she touched was fabric, stiff, old, and brittle with time. She pulled it out slowly, and the moment her eyes registered what it was, a wave of nausea rolled over her. A suit. Not just any suit. Daniel's suit. The one he was supposed to wear on their wedding day, torn, frayed at the edges, as if it had been ripped from his body. Her breath hitched. How? Her hands shook as she reached into the chest again. This time, something small, cold. She lifted it into the light. A ring. His wedding band. Still engraved on the inside with the words she had chosen all those years ago. Forever, my love. Her vision blurred. It wasn't possible. None of this was possible. Her fingers curled around the ring, pressing it into her palm like it could somehow anchor her to reality. And then, beneath the ring, something else. A photograph. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned it over. Daniel, standing in his wedding suit. His expression, different. Not joyful, not excited, but terrified. And beside him, a shadowy figure. Someone dressed in dark clothing, standing just behind him, half obscured, as if whoever took the picture had caught something they weren't supposed to. Her pulse pounded. She had never seen this photo before. Who took it? Why was it in this chest? Her hands fumbled inside, pushing aside the fabric, the ring, the photograph. Until she felt something else. Wood, a false bottom. Her chest tightened. She hesitated, and then with careful fingers, she pried it open. Beneath it, a stack of papers, a letter. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Daniel's. Her breath shuddered as she unfolded the first page, her eyes scanning the words. Sophie, if you're reading this, I never left you. I was taken, and I've been closer than you think. Her body went cold. Closer. Her gaze flickered around the room, the darkened corners, the silent walls, the shadows that suddenly felt deeper than before. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep reading. I didn't run away. I didn't get cold feet. They took me before I could say, I do. They told me if I tried to call for help, they'd hurt you. They said they'd been watching us for a long time. I don't know who they are, but they wanted something. Something I didn't understand, and they wouldn't let me go. I tried to escape. I tried to come back to you, but every time I got close, they stopped me. And then they brought me here, to this house, to this basement. Sophie, I never left. I've been here all along. Her stomach dropped. She read the words over and over again, her mind struggling to process them. Daniel had been here? In this house? All this time? A shiver crawled up her spine. No, that was impossible. She would have known. She would have felt him. Wouldn't she? Her fingers clenched around the letter, her knuckles turning white. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just an old chest with forgotten memories. This was something else. Something that had been hidden from her for 20 years. And suddenly, she wasn't sure she was alone anymore. Would you stop reading? Would you run? Or would you keep searching for the truth? Tell me in the comments, if you were Sophie, what would you do next? Sophie's hands trembled as she clutched the letter. The words blurred before her eyes, but their meaning burned into her mind. I never left. I've been here all along. Here? In this house? No, it wasn't possible. She had lived here for years. She had walked these floors, slept beneath this roof, spent countless nights listening to the silence. She had never heard a sound, never felt a presence. Had she? Her breath came in shallow gasps as she forced herself to move, to push aside the suffocating dread that curled around her like a vice. Daniel had to be lying. Or maybe this was a cruel joke. A sick game someone was playing. And yet, the key, the chest, the letter. It all led her here, and there was still more to find. She turned back to the wooden box, her pulse hammering in her ears. Her fingers traced the edges, searching. If there was a false bottom, maybe there was something else. Then, a slight shift. A faint, hollow thud beneath the chest. Her heart skipped a beat. Slowly, she pushed the chest aside. The floor beneath it was different. A section of the wooden planks was slightly raised, just enough to be noticed. A hidden door. Her fingers curled under the edge, and with a deep breath, she pulled. Dust and splinters rained down as the panel groaned open, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath. A staircase, narrow, steep, leading further into the earth. A place that shouldn't exist. A place that had been hiding beneath her feet for 20 years. A rush of cold air hit her, damp and stale. The scent of decay, of something ancient and forgotten. Her breath hitched, and then a sound, faint, barely there, but real. A whisper of movement, a soft clink of metal. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the opening. Was she imagining it? Or was someone down there? She grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness, revealing a narrow passageway lined with stone walls. The staircase stretched downward, disappearing into the unknown. She hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to stop, to turn around, to not go down those stairs. But she had come this far. And if there was even the slightest chance, if Daniel was truly here, she had to know. One step, then another. The wooden steps creaked beneath her weight. The air thickened, pressing in on her. Each breath felt heavier, like the walls were closing in. She reached the bottom. The passage stretched ahead, the walls narrowing. Pipes lined the ceiling, rusted and dripping with condensation. A single light bulb flickered overhead, its weak glow barely illuminating the space. And then, a sound. This time, unmistakable. A rattle. Chains. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. The beam of her flashlight shook as she raised it, her hands unsteady. And then, she saw him. Her knees nearly buckled. A figure, thin, gaunt. Chained to the farthest wall, his body slumped forward. His clothes hung loose on his skeletal frame, his skin pale and stretched too tightly over his bones. His wrists, raw from the iron shackles. His head hung low, hair matted, his breathing shallow. And yet, she knew him. Even after all these years, she knew him. Daniel. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She took a trembling step forward. His body twitched. A soft, broken groan escaped his lips. Then, slowly, painfully, he lifted his head, and their eyes met. Sophie's breath hitched. For a moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The world shrank, the weight of 20 years pressing down on them. Then, a single tear rolled down Daniel's cheek. Sophie. The sound of his voice, hoarse, weak, barely more than a whisper, shattered something inside her. She stumbled forward, dropping to her knees, reaching for him. Her fingers hovered over his face, afraid to touch, afraid he might disappear. Afraid this was just another dream. But he was real. He was here. Alive. 20 years. 20 years of suffering. 20 years of silence. She choked back a sob, her hands gripping his wrists, feeling the weight of the chains that bound him. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Daniel swallowed, his throat working to form words that had been trapped for so long. "They never let me leave." A shiver ran down her spine. Who? Who had done this? Why? She scanned the room, her mind racing. There had to be a way to free him. She had to get him out of here. But as she reached for the chains, as her fingers brushed against the rusted iron, a sound, louder this time, from somewhere above, a door slamming, footsteps, heavy, coming closer. Her blood ran cold. They weren't alone. Someone else was here, and they weren't going to let her leave. And there he was, Daniel. A man thought lost to time, chained, weak but alive. 20 years of suffering, 20 years of silence. Who did this? Why? The answers would change everything. But before we get there, tell me, what would you do if you found the love of your life trapped beneath your own home? The footsteps grew louder. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drum against her ribs. Whoever was up there, whoever had been keeping Daniel down here, was coming. She turned to him, fingers still gripping his wrists, desperate to find a way to break the chains. "We have to get out of here," she whispered, panic tightening her throat. Daniel's eyes flickered with something between exhaustion and urgency. "The key," he rasped. "They keep it upstairs." The realization hit her like a slap. Whoever had locked him here, they were in the house. She turned toward the staircase, dread curling in her stomach like smoke. She had to get past them. She had to fight. She had to... A loud creak above, and then silence. Had they left? Had they realized she was down here? Daniel's breath was shallow, his strength fading. She made a choice. Sophie shot up the stairs, moving as fast as she dared, her pulse hammering in her ears. She reached the basement door, pushing it open just a crack. The house was empty, no footsteps, no voices, just silence. She moved quickly, scanning the room. The key. Where was the key? Then, a small box, sitting on the edge of an old table. Her hands flew to it, prying it open with shaking fingers. Inside, a single, rusted key. She grabbed it and ran. Back down the stairs, back into the darkness, back to Daniel. His eyes met hers as she rushed to him, pressing the key into the lock. It stuck for a moment, rusted with time, but then... Click. The chains fell away. Daniel collapsed into her arms. She held him, his frail body against hers, shaking with relief. For 20 years, she had searched for answers. And now, she had found him. The nightmare was over. Days later. The house stood empty now. The authorities had come. Investigations had begun. The news spread like wildfire. Missing Groom found alive after 20 years, held captive beneath his own home. Sophie stood outside, watching the police tape flutter in the wind. She had spent so long trapped in the past, haunted by questions. Now she had her answers. And yet, some mysteries would never fully unravel. Who had done this? Why? The people who had taken him had vanished, leaving nothing but shadows behind. But none of that mattered now, because Daniel was free. And love had won. She turned to him, his fingers lacing through hers. The past was behind them. The future was theirs to take. The days that followed were a whirlwind of police sirens, flashing cameras, and questions. So many questions. Sophie and Daniel were pulled into a storm of media frenzy. Reporters desperate for details. The world trying to make sense of the impossible story. How could a man disappear on his wedding day and remain trapped beneath his own home for 20 years? Who was responsible? And how had they managed to keep it a secret for so long? The investigation was relentless. Authorities combed through every inch of the house, searching for evidence. And then one night, just when Sophie thought the worst was over, her phone rang. It was the lead detective. "We found something." Her stomach clenched. She met them at the police station, her hands icy as she walked through the sterile hallways, escorted into a dimly lit interrogation room. And that's when she saw them. Two figures sitting across from her, hands cuffed to the metal table. She froze. Her wedding planner. And her former landlord, the man who had owned the house before she bought it. Her breath caught in her throat. She had trusted them. She had never suspected them. The detective cleared his throat, flipping open a folder. We traced multiple property records. Turns out, the house was owned by Mr. Graves here. He nodded toward the landlord. For over 3 decades. But here's what doesn't add up. Daniel was taken 20 years ago, and according to our records, the only people who had access to that house before Sophie moved in were him and Mrs. Weller. Sophie's mind reeled. Why? Why would they do this? She opened her mouth to speak, but Graves leaned forward, a slow, chilling smile spreading across his face. "You have no idea how deep this goes," he said softly. A shiver crawled down her spine. The detective continued. "We found journal entries, old notes. Mrs. Weller, do you want to tell Sophie what you wrote?" The woman who had planned her wedding, refused to look up. Her shoulders shook, her fingers twisting together in her lap. Sophie's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Why?" A long silence. And then, the woman finally spoke. "I didn't want you to have him." The words hit Sophie like a slap. Her wedding planner, the woman who had helped her pick flowers, her dress, the venue, had stolen Daniel from her. Her stomach churned. But the landlord? How was he involved? The detective pushed a photo across the table. A grainy, black and white image. A much younger version of Graves, standing beside a shadowy figure, the same one from the photograph Sophie had found in the chest. "Mr. Graves has a history," the detective continued. "Let's just say, Daniel wasn't the first, but he was the one that survived." Sophie's breath came in short gasps. Daniel, the love of her life. Taken. For what? A sick obsession? A twisted game? The detective leaned in, his eyes sharp. "The evidence is overwhelming. They kept him there. They used him, manipulated him. We don't even know the full extent of what they did." He exhaled sharply. "But I promise you, Sophie, they'll never hurt anyone again." The trial was swift. With the letters, the hidden basement, and Daniel's testimony, the case became national news. The whole world watched as Mrs. Weller and Graves were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sophie sat in the courtroom, gripping Daniel's hand. And for the first time in 20 years, she could finally breathe. The trial was over. The world had heard the story, the missing groom, the hidden basement, the people responsible. But one question still lingered. Why? What had they wanted from Daniel? Why keep him alive for 20 years? It was Daniel himself who finally revealed the answer. Sitting in the courtroom, his voice still weak, his hands trembling, he told the truth. And the truth was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. He took a deep breath, looking at Sophie before speaking. "They wanted to replace me." A ripple of confusion spread through the courtroom. Sophie's brows furrowed. "Replace you?" she whispered. Daniel nodded, his eyes dark with memories too painful to bear. Graves. He wasn't just some landlord. He was part of something bigger, a group, a secret society. They had their own rules, their own traditions, and His voice cracked. He looked down at his hands, as if ashamed of what he was about to say. They needed a sacrifice. The room went dead silent. A few jurors gasped. Even the judge's expression hardened. Sophie's breath hitched in her throat. Daniel swallowed hard. "They had been watching us for a long time. My family. Mr. Graves told me. I was chosen before I even met Sophie. They let me fall in love, let me believe I had a future, just so they could take it away." Sophie covered her mouth, nausea twisting in her stomach. Daniel clenched his fists. "I was supposed to die that night, on our wedding night. They had plans, a ritual, something about timing, something about power. But something went wrong. I fought back. And instead of killing me, they decided to keep me, study me, use me." His voice dropped to a whisper. I secretly heard them say, "Mr. Graves, life was now tied to mine. As long as he kept me from the world, he would live extra years, instead of dying since the rituals didn't work." But they lied to me, saying I was special, that I had something they needed. They tried to break me, tried to convince me that the world had moved on, that Sophie had forgotten me, that if I ever escaped, no one would believe me. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. 20 years. 20 years of torture. 20 years of being used for something he still didn't fully understand. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The lead prosecutor turned, his face grim. "We've uncovered evidence, journals, documents, recordings. Graves and Mrs. Weller weren't working alone. They had connections, funding, powerful people backing them. And Daniel wasn't their first victim." The words sent a chill through the air. Not their first victim, just the first to survive. The judge slammed the gavel down, calling for order as chaos erupted in the courtroom. The truth was finally out, and it was more terrifying than anyone had ever imagined.
Following their conviction, Graves and Mrs. Weller were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Investigators dug deeper into their pasts, uncovering chilling evidence, journals, hidden financial records, and old photographs linking them to a network that had long operated in the shadows. The ritual that had kept Daniel imprisoned for 2 decades was just one of many twisted schemes they had orchestrated over the years. Graves, once a powerful figure in his secret circle, grew frail behind bars. Without Daniel's captivity sustaining whatever sinister belief he clung to, his health deteriorated rapidly. Within months, he was found dead in his cell, his body showing no signs of struggle, just a man who had finally run out of borrowed time. Mrs. Weller, however, remained silent. Even as investigators pressed her for more details about their operation, she never revealed the full truth. She spent her days in solitary confinement, staring at the walls, whispering to herself. Some said she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. Others believed she had finally lost her grip on reality. But one thing was certain: whatever secrets she still held, she would take them to her grave. Love, loss, and time. Sophie never gave up, and because of that, she found the truth. Some mysteries take a lifetime to solve, but in the end, love is the one thing that never truly fades. If you were in Sophie's shoes, would you have kept searching? Or would you have given up long ago? Comment your thoughts below. Thank you for watching Rare Tales Unfold. If you loved this story, hit the like button, share this with a friend, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories. Remember, subscribing is totally free, and it helps us bring you more thrilling stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. See you in the next one.